Good morning, everyone. My name is Karina Traits, and I'm here with Angie Sassano and Chris Mays, and a group of wonderful people, including our guest speaker, Dr. Sophie Chao, at Deacon Downtown in Melbourne, and really honoured and pleased to welcome you all today to the unceded land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. And it's really important to note how this land, I think, nourishes us. And I think we'll be thinking critically over the next 2 days about the relations involved in those longer histories. Just a quick note to say that this Metabolic Matterings Workshop has its origins in a reading group started by Chris Mays and myself a few years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, within the CES stream of the Alfred Deakin Institute at Deakin University, and is a culmination of a conversation that we've been having over the last 3 years with a wonderful group of people. And we'd like to invite anyone to join our reading group. So please do send us an email if you'd like to be part of this metabolics and biopolitics discussion that is ongoing. And we just want to really thank the CES stream of the ADI who's funded this event, and also to thank the SSN for their support and the Institute of Postcolonial Studies, who have been very generous in hosting us tomorrow as we write and think and eat together. I'll now hand over to Angie Sassano, who will introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Karina. So today for our keynote, we're thrilled to welcome Dr. Sophie Chao, who'll be presenting a paper titled Eating and Being Eaten, More Than Human Metabolisms on the West Papuan Agribusiness Frontier. So Sophie is a Decker Fellow and lecturer in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Sydney. And as an environmental anthropologist and humanities scholar, Sophie's research has really explores interesting intersections across capitalism, ecology, indigeneity, health, and justice across the Pacific. Before academia, Sophie also worked for Forest Peoples Program, which is an Indigenous rights organisation in the UK and Indonesia. And this you see this work influencing some of the academic work in West Papua. And Sophie's also the author of the fantastic book In the Shadow of the Palms, More Than Human Becomings in West Papua. And that was also something we were reading in our reading book, which influenced the direction of this keynote. And also the co-editor of The Promise of Multi-Species Justice alongside Karen Bolenda and Eben Kirksey. So we're excited to welcome Sophie and to hear some excellent and critical insights on metabolic understandings in West Papua, and hopefully we'll have a really enriching discussion following that. So take it away, Sophie.
Just going to start the recording. Probably easier for us.
Thank you so much to ADI and in particular to Chris and Tim for inviting me to deliver this keynote. And I also want to thank Angie and Karina for the tremendous logistical labor that went into making this event possible. I'm really thrilled, really honored to be in conversation with all of you, both here in person and online. So the paper I'm presenting today draws on a broader research project and work in progress book that together examine how deforestation and agribusiness expansion in West Papua are reconfiguring the food-based identities, socialities, and ecologies of the Indigenous Marind peoples, whom I've had the immense privilege to learn from and think with over the course of this last decade, and whose ways and words I'll be sharing with you today. I want to say that preparing this talk with the workshop's theme of metabolic matterings in mind actually brought me to revisit a lot of this material in a new and different light. And for that, I'm incredibly grateful. It is a work in progress paper, so I'm very keen to hear your thoughts on how the metabolic angle in particular could be further foregrounded or finessed. And of course, I'm equally excited to learn more about your own research projects in the course of the next 2 days as we think, feel, eat our way through metabolic matterings. So with that, let me begin. Sitting cross-legged on the front porch of her hut in the Papuan village of Bayau, Anna, an Indigenous Marind woman in her mid-20s, watched the sun sink against the bleary, haze-filled sky. It was a torrid evening in late December 2016, The air quivered with swarms of mosquitoes, their languorous buzzing mingling with the metallic rattle of chainsaws in a nearby oil palm plantation and the irregular wheezing of Anna's two youngest children, Julius and Circia, who lay slumbering in a cot of woven sago fibers. Anna slowly massaged her slender legs, then the lids of her sunken eyes, and then her protruding stomach, where her sixth child was growing. She said she was anxious that this child was weak and would not grow well, just like her 5 other children who were not fed well. Just a few days earlier, Anna's elder sister, Michaela, had lost a second child in labor, a tragedy that my companion attributed to Michaela not eating enough sago and to her husband not hunting enough game. Anna ran her fingers along the frail limbs of her children and murmured, "I worry about these children. I worry about the world they will inherit. For this is not a nourishing world. It is a world that will give them nothing good to eat, but that will eat them. It is a world of many different hungers." Then Anna began to sing. And here I'm going to recite Anna's song in its original language of Logat Papua, the translation for which is on the slide. Ada lagu buat semuanya di tanah-tanah ini. Lagu buat Kaswari, lagu buat Sagu, lagu buat Pinang, lagu buat Surya, lagu yang cerita hujan, lagu yang cerita tanah, lagu yang cerita getah, lagu yang cerita keringat. Tapi setelah sawit datang, kita orang nyanyi lagu baru. Ada lagu tentang hujan, dusun sagu dan sungai diberi makan. Ada lagu tentang jalan, perkebunan, dan kota dimakan kita. Ada lagu tentang kelaparan untuk sagu, uang, dan plastik. Saya nyanyi buat anak-anak yang sudah lahir dan belum. Saya nyanyi buat pace-pace, dijual tanah kita. Saya nyanyi buat kelaparan yang hantui tanah ini. Lapar selalu, lapar di mana-mana. Lapar terus-menerus, lapar sebar-menyebar. Tidak pernah berakhir, tidak pernah berhenti. Lapar yang hantui tanah lapar ini. In the last decade, hunger songs, or lagu kelaparan, such as the one crafted by my companion Anna, have become increasingly prevalent amongst the Indigenous Marind inhabitants of Merauke in the Indonesian colonized region of West Papua. The emergence of this new genre coincides with an unprecedented intensification in deforestation and oil palm expansion across Marind's customary lands and territories. Performed primarily by women, hunger songs juxtapose the storied origins, lives, and relations of Marind to their plant and animal kin, with the deleterious effects of waning traditional food environments on their collective well-being, bodies, and futures. These songs are performed across the public and private domains of home and hearth, village and grove, and forest and plantation. Their lyrics conjure the transformation of nourishing, sentient forests into impoverished extractive zones. They speak to the emergence of an increasingly discordant and disfigured landscape, haunted by a multitude of famished beings whose hungers many Marind, like Anna, describe as new, different, and insatiable. Drawing on long-term fieldwork conducted in rural Merauke, this talk explores the meaning of hunger, as it is lived and theorized by the Indigenous Marind inhabitants of an emergent plantation frontier. Specifically, it asks, how do Marind sense and make sense of hunger? How does hunger multiply depending on its relative subjects and objects? And how do Indigenous theories of hunger offer new ways of thinking about metabolic justice and the relationship between environment, food, and nourishment in an age of self-devouring growth? As the narrative that follows will show, hunger and metabolic justice among Marind cannot be reduced to an individual biophysical state defined purely in nutritional, quantitative, or even human terms. Rather, hunger traverses variably situated humans, animals, plants, and infrastructures who are bound with and against each other in more or less reciprocal relations of feeding and being fed. Across these diverse ecologies of hunger, different foods and associated metabolic processes serve different purposes, some destructive, others generative, and all always dependent upon and diagnostic of the intersubjective relationship between consumer and consumed. When approached through the lens of Indigenous Marind philosophies and practices, then hunger reveals itself a multiple, more than human, and morally imbued modality of being, one whose etiologies and effects are no less culturally crafted or contested than food and eating. The experiences and theories I'm going to draw on in making these points are rooted in situated socio-cultural frameworks, geopolitical contexts, and settler-colonial histories that are specific to West Papua. But as I will show, the significance of these theories extends well beyond the Papuan frontier. Rather, Marind's critiques of the broader political and economic forces transforming their forests, foodways, and futures speak visceral, if unpalatable, truths about the capitalist illogic of limitless surplus, profit, growth, and accumulation that dictates who must go hungry in order for whom to be fed. These critiques bring us to rethink capitalist modernity itself as a regime of excessive and insatiable hunger, one that banalizes the needs of others and neglects the important lessons that hunger as a relation might teach us. In framing hunger as a more than human condition and crisis of being, then, Marind raised important and necessarily unsettling questions for all of us around what it means to eat well in an epoch of ecological unravelling, when industrial activities are undermining possibilities of life and nourishment at a planetary scale. And in that respect, Marind's theories of hunger are just as much about us as they are about them. In making the points in this talk, I'm going to be drawing primarily from the perspectives and discourses of Marind women. While both gendered and generational differences shape the gastropolitical terrains of rural Merauke, it was first and foremost Marind women who acted as my mentors in understanding what it meant to eat well and feed well in a more than human world. These women would explain their particular interest in questions of hunger and food as intrinsically linked to their own sense of identity and pride as food providers and nurturing mothers. But their investment in these questions also stemmed from other, more covert sentiments. On the one hand, speaking about hunger offered an avenue for women to condemn the effects of settler-colonial and capitalist violence on Marind and on West Papuans collectively as Indigenous peoples. But over time, it became clear that talking about hunger also enabled women to voice their frustrations, resentment, and anger towards Marind men within their communities, whose monopoly over decisions to surrender land to or cooperate with oil palm companies many women saw as exacerbating food insecurity on the ground. In this respect, then, women's hunger narrative served a cathartic function in communicating and critiquing internal gendered power asymmetries that, if not new, had become newly prominent amidst intensifying land conversions. At the same time, however, this cathartic function of talking about hunger was often accompanied by an equally strong sense of shame among Marind women, who read in hunger a testament to their own failure to fulfill the needs of Marind generations present and to come. This shame was compounded with uncertainties amongst my companions over whom exactly was to blame for the emergence of new and different hungers, and how and whether these hungers and stories of metabolic injustice should be storied for global audiences. It was these conflicting perspectives that in turn opened space for broader conversations with my friends about power asymmetries writ small and large, between Marind men and women in the villages, between colonizing regimes and indigenous peoples in West Papua, and also between foreign researchers, their audiences, and the communities they claim to speak about, with, or for. Before we jump into these bigger questions, allow me to flesh out the ethnographic setting where this story unfolds. So we're traveling this morning to the upper reaches of the Bian River in the Indonesian province of West Papua, located on the western half of the island of New Guinea. This area sits within the customary territories of the Upper Bian Marind people, who number around 600 households in the area. Marind of the Upper Bian rely directly on the environment for their daily subsistence. Sago groves provide them with their staple starch, sago flour, which is manually extracted from the interior of sago trunks. Carbohydrates obtained from sago flour are supplemented with tubers and roots, and proteins obtained from fish and game, including deer, lorises, possums, cassowaries, tree kangaroos, crocodiles, and wild pigs. Fruit, including rambutans, papayas, bananas, golden apples, and coconuts are also gathered in the forest alongside edible roots, barks, and saps. These forest foodways are widely associated by Marind with the condition of kekenyangan, or satiety, a complex composite of bodily affects that stem as much from the vitality of the living organisms that these foods are obtained from, as from the environments, socialities, and memories that these foods conjure and crystallize. As my friends would explain, forest foods create ecological satiety by virtue of the intimate and ancestral relations that Marind entertain with the plants and animals from which they derive, together with the diverse stories and songs that enliven their meanings as cherished kin and as nourishing foods. This diversity is reflected in turn in the diversity of foodstuffs that Marind emphasize are necessary in the making of a satiating meal: sago starch, cassowary meat, papaya leaves, coconut flesh, and more. All of these foods derive from organisms that sustain each other through mutual relations of eating and being eaten, and all are best consumed in the forest, where full-bodied auditory, olfactory, and kinesthetic immersion further enhance food's sensory attributes, affective valences, and nourishing qualities. These bodily affects include the pleasurable tickle on the skin and warmth of the belly that Marind describe as semangat, or energy, the animated bustle of human bodies laboring and eating together in the grove that Marind refer to as ramai, or liveliness, and the moments also of meditative reflection and silent observation that punctuate food procurement activities, one that Marind call damai, or peace. Forest foods accrue further significance in light of their association with the strengthening of bodily skin and wetness among those who ingest them. Skin here refers to the epidermis of humans, but also the bark of trees, the coats of mammals, the laminae of leaves, the carapace of beetles, the cuticle of larvae, also the relief of the land and the rippled surfaces of rivers and streams. Wetness, meanwhile, takes the form of bodily fluids, including blood, grease, muscle, sweat, saliva, and tears. In vegetal organisms, wetness manifests as resin, sap, and pith, and the water-carrying xylem of roots, stems, and shoots. Skin and wetness as life-sustaining forces are generated through organisms' symbiotic relations to one another and in turn enhance their aesthetic and gustatory qualities as food for humans. For instance, people who eat sago from the grove ingest the wetness of the palm and the wetness of the rivers, soils, and species that sustain the palm's growth, together with the sweat of the adults who procured and prepared it. In the process, matter and meaning condense across myriad organs and organisms, caught up in a ceaseless metabolic exchange of nourishing bodily substances. These exchanges of flesh and fluid manifest most vividly in the practice of pre-mastication, wherein villagers will chew food prepared for them by others, spit it out into their hands, and then respectfully offer it to their loved ones to eat. Through these transcorporeal exchanges, Marind bestow upon their companions not only the vitality of the foods consumed, but also a literal part of their own self in the form of cells, sweat, and saliva, in what is considered as one of the most tangible testaments of care and kinship, albeit one that I certainly myself took a while to get used to. But human satiation is only one part of the story of metabolic relationality. Just as important as the nourishment obtained by Marind from the forest is the nourishment that Marind themselves provide for their other than human kin. Being Marind, as many of my friends would explain, means becoming good food for others. Jadi makanan enak buat yang lain. Echoing Bao Plamwood's invitation to become prey, becoming good food for others entails participating in chains of eating and being eaten within a multi-species spectrum whose collective well-being depends upon the willingness of every organism, human and other, to inhabit and to shift across multiple interlinked subjectivities, as feeder, as fed, and as food. In the process, the trope of social and environmental relations is given metabolic and moral expression. Transfers of bodily wetness are one way in which Marind become good food for others. For instance, the sweat of villagers is said to sustain the growth of vegetation when it comes into contact with branches, leaves, twigs, as people walk the forest. Sweat infiltrates the soil as people labor in the grove, nourishing a mixed community of insects and gastropods, including centipedes, snails, and grubs, and also infiltrating the root systems of nearby shrubs and grasses. Human blood, meanwhile, becomes fodder for hematophagous critters, such as leeches and mosquitoes. When breastfeeding, women nourish the forest by smearing droplets of colostrum on the trunks of sago palms to encourage vegetative propagation, and they also bury the placenta in the forest to nourish its soils. Even after death, people continue to become good food for others when their flesh and fluids buried in the ground seep into the soil and enrich its nutrients, or when these flesh and fluids are metabolized by subterranean earthworms, beetles, and millipedes. Animals that prey upon these organisms in turn take in the skin and wetness of the deceased, passing it on to their own progenies and eventually returning it to the forest when they themselves die or are consumed. Eating well during one's own lifetime, then, matters not only for the health and well-being of the consumer, but also because it enables the consumer to feed other than human beings whose skin, wetness, and vitality disperse, cycle, and recycle within the metabolic flows of the forest, as what Deborah Bird Rose might call a nourishing terrain. But what of these nourishing terrains today? Over the last decade, Marin's foodways have been radically undermined as a result of intensified deforestation and industrial oil palm expansion across their lands and territories. And this has had detrimental impacts on both their access to food and on their nutritional health. Data I obtained from local clinics reveals soaring rates of malnutrition, wasting, and stunting in the area, with particularly dire impacts among women, babies, and infants, and also showing a strong correlation with areas where deforestation was underway. Of the dozens of children who passed away during my fieldwork, an overwhelming majority died of malnutrition-related musculoskeletal, gastrointestinal, and immune system ailments, including diarrhea, anemia, tuberculosis, gastroenteritis, and bronchopneumonia. Rising chronic protein energy malnutrition among inhabitants of the Upper Bian has also been linked to increasing cases of premature births, miscarriages, liver disease, and goiters. These disturbing local realities are in turn symptomatic of a growing trend of malnutrition across the province of West Papua, which represents Indonesia's most food insecure region. Individuals afflicted by hunger see their skin become parched, pale, and rough, their limbs thin, their bones brittle, and their participation in social activities limited by weakness and lethargy. Depleted skin and wetness manifests in the shrinking biceps and calves of men, the sagging breasts and sallow cheeks of women, and the sunken eyes and decreased skin turgor of babies and infant skin. These transformations are said by Marind to be contagious to others, who, in witnessing the hunger of their kin, will also begin to feel their own bodies weaken, their concentration fail, and their desire to interact, walk the forest, and forage together decrease. Hunger here is not just a metabolic condition, but also a communicable disease, one that manifests in a range of different forms. One new and different hunger that Marind associate with deforestation is the hunger for sago, the food from which they obtain their staple starch, and also a word that is synecdochal with forest foods more generally in Marind parlance. The hunger for sago, as my friend Sirsia, portrayed here, explained, is one that grips the gut and weakens the legs. It is a hunger that causes anger and grief amongst those no longer able to travel the forest, encounter their sibling plants and animals, and recount their lively stories and pasts. It is a hunger that arises from the severance of mutual relations of feeding and being fed that Marind once entertained with a sentient forest ecology. Whilst Marind experienced hunger for sago in the villages, Sirsia continued, their forest kin too struggle to survive as biodiverse landscapes give way to industrial monocrops, where little food is to be found, and where animals become vulnerable to chemical pesticides, illegal poaching, rumbling vehicles, and introduced predators. Hunger for sago, then, speaks to the growing incapacity of Marind to be fed by the forest and to feed the forest themselves through kinesthetic exchanges of skin and wetness. It points to the indissociability of food justice from multi-species justice, as these manifest in the profound interdependencies of human and non-human metabolisms. As the forest diminishes, Marind have now become increasingly dependent on imported foods, such as instant noodles, biscuits, and rice, which now compose over 4/5 of their daily calorific intake. Some Marind are now developing an appetite for these foreign commodities, or what some of my friends call a hunger for plastic foods. Plastic in Marind parlance refers to foods, things, places, practices, and persons that are associated with modernity and that are characterized by their uncontrolled proliferation and their deceptive allure. People would explain to me that While forest foods were disappearing, carton after carton after carton of rice, instant noodles and biscuits would flood the villages. These foods arrive in attractive, shiny plastic wrappings, but they are not satiating and instead are said to exacerbate the hunger of those who consume them. The palatability of these foods is further undermined by the fact that their places of origins and their producers are distant and unknown. As Maria, a young girl from Baya, put it, plastic foods are not nourishing because they do not taste of the land. The gustatory subversion wrought by plastic foods work in conjunction with a third type of hunger that Marind call the hunger for money. This hunger is one that is often attributed to men who have accepted compensation payments from oil palm corporations or sought employment on the plantations as harvesters and pesticide sprayers. Men who hunger for money, I was often told, keep this money for their own enjoyment rather than share it with their kin. The money they eat or spend is used to purchase items or on activities that are deemed wasteful, selfish, or immoral. Some, for instance, use the money to purchase fridges and televisions, even though there is no signal or electricity in the village. Others are said to procure alcohol from village kiosks or in the city, and then become dangerously violent towards fellow villagers when inebriated. Never satisfied with what they consume, people who eat money seek pleasure in things and places that, much like plastic foods, exacerbate rather than satiate their desires, whilst also undermining the material and moral well-being of their broader community. As such, the hunger for money offers a potent idiom to speak to the detrimental effects of individualistic behaviors on the metabolisms, bodies, and futures of Marind and their more than human kin. It is a hunger that conjures a fragmentation of clans, once united through shared experiences of eating in the forest, but now pitting against each other over cash and contracts. The repercussions of this self and other destroying cycle extends across species and generations, as people feed not with or from each other, but rather off one another. At the same time as Marind are becoming the subjects of hungers for sago, plastic, and money, they are also becoming the objects of hungers that are said to stem from an array of invasive forces, whose veracity is idiomatized by Marind as a form of pathological hyperphagia. In other words, Marind are not just going hungry and suffering metabolic injustice, they are also being eaten. One entity haunting what my companion Anna called the land of famished beings is the road. Roads, Anna explained, devour the forest and erode the soils upon which they are built. They tear across the landscape in multiplying capillaries of dust, fumes, and asphalt, consuming all manner of vegetation and reducing them to rubble. Roads are also said to prey upon the bodies of Marind travelers by taking them far from their lands and villages. When prolonged or frequent, road journeys are said to eat people's identities by making them forget their Papuan roots and cultures, their native dialects, their traditional foodways, and their ancestral ties to the nourishing forest. The hunger of roads works in conjunction with the hunger of the city. For Marind, the city refers to Merauke, the district's capital, the closest urban center to their villages, and the one that most have frequented at least once in their lives. As with roads, cities are said to be places that eat Marind's pride and well-being. They are inhabited primarily by non-Papuan settlers and are seen by Marind to be foreign and alien, associated with feelings of vulnerability, shame, and fear. People who spend extended time in the city are said to develop a hunger for plastic foods. They also become vulnerable to illnesses that eat their bodies and those of their kin. One such illness is HIV/AIDS, a prevalent disease in Merauke that many Marind men are believed to have contracted from their encounters with non-Papuan sex workers in the city, and one that is said to eat their flesh and fluids until they waste away into skin and bones. The symbolic consumption of indigenous bodies in the city takes particularly sinister forms for Marind women, who are vulnerable to the violence of shame of being eaten, in this instance meaning sexually abused, by city dwellers when they travel to the city on their own and at night. As Pia, a young woman from Baya village, explained, in the city, hungry men want to eat our bodies. After men have eaten our bodies, then shame eats our bodies. The city is a hungry, dangerous place for women. The rapacious appetite of infrastructures like roads and cities operates in tandem to the hunger of oil palm, an introduced cash crop that is rapidly taking over Marin's lands and forests. Oil palm, as I explore in my book, is widely described by Marind as a person of sorts, one that is selfish, greedy, and immoral. Oil palm, my friends would explain, eats the forests, depletes the soil of its nutrients, and saps the rivers diverted to irrigate plantations. Oil palm also eats time by erasing the relations of more than human beings once inscribed in the landscape, thereby threatening their shared futures and their capacity to sustain each other through mutual metabolic relations of feeding and being fed. The hunger of oil palm also manifests from Marind in the form of dreams that my companions describe as being eaten by oil palm. In these events, sleepers witness and experience their death repeatedly, both from their own human perspective and also from the perspectives of forest creatures whose lifeways, too, are jeopardized by plantation expansion, cassowaries, birds of paradise, boars, nipa palms, and more. Dreams of being eaten by oil palm result in sudden onsets of malaria, dengue fever, migraines, and appetite loss. Victims are said to become taciturn and refuse to participate in social activities, such as the sharing of food, hunting, and foraging. Their flesh dries out and their skin becomes dull. Across the waking and sleeping worlds, then, oil palm's hunger literally and symbolically depletes the energies and bodies of those it consumes, eating away at the landscape to feed places and peoples far removed from the forests and beings obliterated in its wake. Just as important to Marind as the who of hunger is its why, a why that is widely debated among Marind as they struggle to make sense of hunger's etiology or causes. Exemplifying what Will Smith calls a stance of self-culpabilization, some of my companions interpret hunger as a collective punishment meted upon them by their ancestral spirits for their failure to protect the forest and its diverse life forms from death and destruction. Other villagers, meanwhile, identify the roots of hunger in the violent history of Papuan oppression under Indonesian occupation. Hunger here constitutes what Kyle Powys-White might term a colonial déjà vu, one that appears new, but that in fact speaks to the ongoing disposability and exploitability of indigenous Papuan bodies and ecosystems under Indonesian rule. A third explanatory model of hunger draws on notions of martyrdom and salvation derived from Catholicism to frame hunger as a form of sacrifice. During church sermons, for instance, priests would often describe the prevalence of hunger as a test of religious faith, a reminder of the importance of prayer and belief in overcoming pain and suffering, and a condition not to be explained or rationalized, but rather accepted and endured. But there is another dimension to the etiology of hunger as self-sacrifice at play here. Bendita, a mother of three from Mirav, portrayed in the center of the photo here, explained this stance as follows. We live in a world where not everybody gets to eat, or eat well, or eat enough. This is not unique to Marind, or Papuans, or Melanesians. This is simply the way capitalism works, here, there, everywhere. Some people must go hungry in order for others to be fed. Bendita's statement speaks to an acute awareness on her part of the machinations of neoliberal capitalist illogic, an illogic that operates through the consumption of the bodies and futures of some groups, resulting from the hunger for profit of others. Under this logic, hunger is not only, or perhaps even at all, a consequence of the failure of the modern capitalist food system. Rather, hunger is capitalism's very own ontology and a symptom of its success. The ontology of capitalism and the machinations of the modern capitalist world was broadly something that captured the curiosity of many of my friends in the field. Specifically, it brought them to speculate whether the problem, masala, with the modern world is that it is too hungry, or whether it is that it no longer knows what hunger is at all. Olivia, an elderly woman from Halayan village, explained this apparent paradox to me as follows. She said, in the modern world, powerless people like us must go hungry so that powerful people can be fed. This is just how the modern world works. But these powerful people, they never seem to be satiated. They keep eating up the land, the resources, the water, the money, the coal, the wood, and more. They own phones and cars and houses and planes, even cities, islands, and soon enough, planets in outer space. She's making a gesture to Elon Musk's outer space project here, one base of which is in Papua. Are these people never full? Are they never content? Are they never satisfied? They make little people go hungry, but they too seem always to be hungry for more. Is hunger then a blessing or a curse? Is to become hungry, in fact, to become modern? So this is a quote that I've had to sit with for a very long time to sort of unpack in terms of all its different ramifications. Echoing Paul Gilroy's theorization of the Black Atlantic as a counterculture, Olivia's incisive speculation offers a powerful counter-narrative to the story that the modern world tells itself about itself, namely that it is defined by progress, freedom, reason, the apex of a unilinear trajectory towards material fulfillment and abundance, set against a putatively backwards and primitive past. Instead, Olivia is provocatively reframing the modern world itself as one that is plagued with an insatiable hunger for material goods and gains that no amount of consumption can ever satiate. And yet, even as this modern world is plagued by endless hungers resulting from the normalization of overabundance, it is also an impoverished world, in that hunger no longer constitutes a meaningful or productive event. This is a world in which what we have outweighs what we need or even want. In the banalization of our own and others' hungers, we lose sight of the peoples and places that feed us and of the more than human metabolic relations that sustain us. Hunger then is not just a byproduct of modern capitalism, suffered by people like the Marind, whose lands are exploited for the nourishment of others. Rather, hunger is here a defining trait and pathology of the globalized modern world itself, within which Marind and their hungers are embedded. As such, hunger may be a diminishing experience, but as Olivia put it, perhaps becoming hungry is also becoming modern. Allow me now to close with some concluding thoughts. Ethnographically grounded investigations of metabolic matterings, such as the one I have attempted to offer here, cast vital light on the political, cultural, and moral dimensions of food and eating that are often obscured in the medicalization, individualization, and rationalization of hunger as a technical concern, best addressed and solved by scientists and policy makers. Such investigations push against the framing of hunger as a universal, biological, quantifiable, or scalable object or referent. They uncover in hunger an assemblage of situated and shifting meanings, narratives, experiences, and affects, combined in particular material and discursive assemblages in particular places and at particular times. This framing brings into the fold of hunger a range of life forms, institutions, and infrastructures that are connected to one another with an unevenly distributed meshworks of feeding and being fed. They point to the ontology of hunger not as an individual condition, but rather and also as a material and moral and metabolic relation that transcends local global divides. Among Marind and West Papua, dilemmas abound over what hunger is, what it does, what can be done with it, why it exists, and why it persists. In the process, hunger reveals itself an effect of externally imposed gastro-colonial regimes, to borrow Chamorro poet Craig Santos Perez's term, and as a site of contested gastropolitics amongst indigenous peoples themselves. In both respects, Marind theories of hunger point to the challenge of achieving food justice amongst peoples and in places that are subjected to the consuming violence of what Valérie Loiseau terms the colonial mouth, or imperialist machines that ingest, disfigure, and dissolve the worlds and subjects exposed to their hunger and greed. As Chris Mays has argued in the Australian context, contemporary food sovereignty and agrarian discourses harnessed to counter the influence of neoliberal agricultural policies often still remain entangled with imperial ideas of improvement, anthropocentric relations to land, and paradigms of property and ownership. In a similar vein, Marind discourses surrounding hunger foreground how achieving indigenous food sovereignty cannot be dissociated from broader questions surrounding indigenous territorial sovereignty and political self-determination, or from the environmental and social dimensions of food injustice, as they undermine Indigenous peoples' collective capacity to maintain their integrity, health, and relations to other than human beings and ecosystems. Metabolic thinking and being, then, to transpose Kim Tolbert's terms, needs Indigenous standpoints. More specifically, perhaps, Marind theories of hunger invite us to reimagine struggles for social and environmental justice as mediated and moved by the pursuit of what I call metabolic justice. In deploying the etic language of metabolic justice, I find inspiration in the work of arts and humanities scholars who are drawing attention to how dynamics of absorption, ingestion, and transformation either sustain or undermine organismic well-being across individuals and collectives. As a distributed process of conversion and connection, metabolism draws into the fold the bodies of the eaters, their organs, cells, and tissues, and the bodies of those eaten, the plants, animals, and ecosystems whose own metabolic activity makes food for humans possible. Metabolism also encompasses the transformations wrought by exposures to medication, sensory stimuli, and environmental toxins. It is, in Hannah Landaker's terms, an in-betweenness of body and environment that, in its in-betweenness, challenges the boundedness and separability of bodies from their constitutive environments. Hunger, as the central optic in this paper, is perhaps counterintuitively good to think with in theorizing metabolic justice. Hunger, in some ways, is the expression of the limits of metabolism and the capacity to metabolize. To be hungry, in its simplest meaning, is to lack the nutrition necessary for metabolic transformation. When hunger reaches an extreme degree, or starvation, the body begins to consume its own internal energy stores in a process known as autophagy. First carbohydrates, then fats, then proteins, and eventually muscle and brain. The body eats itself. At the same time, hunger is a form of pain. And like all other forms of physiological pain, it is a signal to do something, a corporeally mediated call to action in response to absences and damages and debilities within individual bodies that in turn diagnose social dis-ease within broader anatomies of power, domination, and injustice. To reframe hunger as a matter of metabolic justice then helps perhaps draw attention to the uneven intersections and interactions of biopolitical and social life, the human and non-human, the material and the metaphorical, as these are mediated by differently positioned and privileged guts. In the context of intensifying social and environmental crises, thinking with metabolic injustice, as it is articulated by my Marind friends, draws attention also to complicity, non-innocence, and impurity in relations of eating and be eaten. Not just the question of what or whom we eat, but also perhaps what's eating us and what it might mean to become good food for others. In this endeavor, relying on a singular or totalizing grand unified theory, or GUT, to borrow Eduardo Viveros de Castro's acronym, will not do. Instead, and in the spirit of this workshop, we need to think about, with and through multiple and multiply situated guts, human and non-human, organismic and infrastructural, racialized and otherwise hierarchized, and local and global. It is here that Marind metabolic thinking offers us vital food for thought in the labor of reckoning with food injustice in this epoch of planetary unmaking. Their theories are a powerful call for responsibility and repair in the face of a global food production system that is at once profoundly racialized and capitalistic, and that perpetuates imperialism as, in the words of Grace Dillons, the consumption of one people by another. Such imaginaries are crucial in moving beyond what Julia Livingston aptly terms capitalism as self-devouring growth. In this epoch of self-devouring growth, profit and property remain the central operatives of capitalist illogic. When this logic falters, technology and science are heralded as solutions to the suboptimal productivity of nature's turned capital. Modern metabolisms are fed and fueled by a relentless drive to burn shit up and burn shit down. And even as metabolic processes that sustain life on Earth break down and generate what John Foster and others term metabolic rifts, these visions of limitless consumerism continue to obscure and obstruct the interdependent webs of relations that sustain human and other than human life. By failing to nurture and nourish these relations, we unwittingly consume our own futures. Recall here the process of autophagy, the tipping point of hunger, the moment when the body eats itself. Perhaps most importantly, marine theories of hunger demand that we chew on the question that my companions themselves so often ask of the world consuming them, namely, whether the modern condition is one of excessive hunger or whether the overabundance of the world we inhabit in fact preempts us from knowing hunger and the lessons that hunger might teach us about ourselves and about others. It is these reflections and imaginations that animate the more than human gastropolitics of the marine life world, one for whose protagonists the matter at stake in everyday metabolic deeds and decisions remains just as much what to eat or not to eat as to be eaten or to eat, as to eat or be eaten. And with that, I want to leave the last words of my talk to Mina, a 12-year-old marine child from Mira village who sang a hunger song to me in the early days of my fieldwork and whose words first sparked this foray through the land of famished beings. Kulit aku hitam, kulit kau putih, rambut kau keriting, rambut kau lurus. Kalau kau bisa dengar dari tempat-tempat jauh, maka samautannya ini. Jagalah lagu ini dengan baik, macam bulu burung cendrawasih. Simpanlah lagu ini dengan baik, macam tepung-tepung sagu. Peganglah lagu ini dengan baik, macam anak panah ke busur. Kan sah mau tahu ini. Ketika kau makan sapu dusun, kau rasa sapu keringat kah? Ketika kau makan sapu rawa, kau rasa sapu kulit kah? Ketika kau makan sapu sungai, kau dengar sapu suara kah? Ketika kau makan sapu dunang, kau dengar sapu lagu kah? Ketika kau makan sapu hutan, kau rasa sapu lapar kah? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophie. I think that has given everyone in this room and online quite a lot of food for thought, without a pun intended. So we'll have a bit of a question discussion section now. So for those of you in the room, if you've got some questions, start thinking of them. And for those online, I know a few have already popped them in the chat, but feel free to keep doing so. I might start off with my own question, take the time for myself. So at the end, you were talking about what Marind think of what they can do with hunger, and hunger being pain and therefore being a call to action. I was wondering during your time there whether the Marind thought about hunger as a form of refusal to the settler-colonial capitalist regime, and how or if those calls to action have been put in practice.
Thanks so much for getting us started with that question. Yes, I mean, I think the first thing I want to say, and returning to the early framing of the interlocutors that I'm in conversation with here, there are a lot of factions and fragmentations among Marind themselves about whether these plastic foods, these modern foods and everything they incarnate are something to be accepted or embraced, or whether in fact refusal and resistance, are the way forward and the path towards metabolic justice and intergenerational justice for marine generations present and to come. Refusal is certainly a big part of that picture. It takes the form of everyday micro biopolitical acts of refusal, the decision to choose to eat sago over rice, the insistence on visiting the few patches of forest that remain and to instruct children on the arts of hunting and fishing and foraging. Refusal also takes the form of singing songs for roadkill, animals that have been eaten by the road, as a form of refusal to frame these deaths as ungrievable. So these are sort of small, mundane, not necessarily heroic acts of resistance conducted primarily by Marind women, who often are underrepresented in the sort of more formal forms of land rights movements that are underway in Merauke. And planting as well is another form of refusal. Planting bamboo stalks, transplanting sago suckers. It's not just about sustaining the life of these vegetal beings. It's also a strategy to reclaim land you plant, you leave a mark of yourself, you create memories and stories. So in all of these sorts of ways, I'd say that refusal is very much part of the story, and very much part of the sort of gastropolitical tensions also that arise between people who are looking for paths forwards and sort of middle ground between rapidly waning forest foodways and arriving commodified foodways.
Thanks so much. I might go to one of the online questions. So Elaine has said, thanks, Sophie. Loved your keynote. She's curious how you feel about palm oil as an outsider. And she also asks, do you feel like the Marin's suspicion of change is something to be feared and avoided, or an opportunity to adapt, transform, and reimagine ways of living as Marind within a dynamic world?
Thank you so much, Elaine. I'm really sorry I can't see you all, but I'm going to visualize you somehow. Thank you for those two questions. Yes, so the framing of oil palm as an outsider. Many Marind whom I worked with, characterized this introduced species as a distinctly non-Papuan life form, one that they very much, perceive as kind of a biological ally, if you wish, to borrow Crosby's term, of the equally invasive settler-colonial state, settlers and soldiers. So there are some trans-species indexicalities going on here that give rise to that particular characterization of oil palm. That being said, and as with so much of the complexity of Marind epistemologies, that framing is only one part of a more nuanced and in some ways complicated story, in the sense that as much as Marind resent oil palm for its destructive, all-consuming sort of affordances and effects, many Marind also express pity and compassion towards this plant. Why? Because as much as it's destructive, it too is very much subject to the dictates of capitalist logic. It's manipulated, transformed, exploited, transplanted, turned into a commodity. So there are all kinds of, different sentiments and affects surrounding this being that exists as both an invader and a victim, a kind of plant and a kind of person, an invasive present, but also potentially a near kin in the making. So I think all of those aspects, are really important to also foreground in thinking about plant ontologies. As for the suspicion of development, I think certainly what came out very, very strongly from the very outset, my early encounters and interactions with Marind when I was working for the Forest Peoples Program, Indigenous rights organization, was that change and transformation are not something that Marind are opposed to. It's the way in which these changes and transformations are happening, right? So without the free, prior informed consent of local communities, often framed in a paternalistic discourse of progress and civilizationalism, that in turn, of course, positions Indigenous Papuans as backwards, as primitive, as impoverished, and in need of salvation, and through modernist projects like oil palm plantations. So it's not a refusal of change per se, it's a resistance to the deeply diminishing and often dehumanizing ways in which change is framed in government and corporate discourse, and the ways that implemented in ways that don't make space or give space for the voices of people on the ground, and I should say particularly for women on the ground.
Thanks so much. Before I move to another online question, I might open up the floor here in the room if anyone has any questions for Sophie.
I do.
Yeah,
I've got a few,
yes.
but I'll just go with this one to start off with. You mentioned sort of just in passing, and I guess I'm curious to know if to hear more about this idea of hunger as a communicable disease. And I think that's really interesting, having sort of worked around sort of public health and the phrase diet-related non-communicable diseases, and then turned into an acronym, and just the way that I think abstracts, makes me think of like people like, I don't know, Simone Weil and others who will talk about, the abstraction of rights talk from, people are being raped and people are hungry and what have you, in the context she was talking about. And I think similarly, this idea of hunger as a communicable disease in the context of this analysis of, being food for others, this interconnection, multi-species interconnection is really, really interesting to sort of reframe and think about hunger as something that's communicated from one to the other in a similar way to, a virus or what have you. Yeah, so I'd be interested to. Do you do more with that?
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Thank you so much for returning to that. There's so much more to be said. What certainly came out from the fieldwork was that hunger communicates something important about the subjectivity and relationality of both the consumer and the consumed. So it communicates truth, but it's also a communicable disease. Precisely in the sense that there's a certain element. These are empathetic foodways, to borrow Anita von Poster's term, in the sense that the experience of hunger, the witnessing of others' hungers, has effects on the moods, on even the sort of bodily sensations of people who see others experiencing this deeply diminishing sort of reality, and it works in the other direction as well. Witnessing someone else's satiation is often said to nourish and feed and create satiety in the one who's observing, even in the absence of an actual consumption of foods, right? So there's some really interesting, again, hunger is relational and transferable in that sense, and that all becomes all the more interesting, sort of the communicability of hunger, in light of Marind grammars of hunger. So there are 37 different words for hunger in the Marind dialect, each of which is inflected by who is hungry, what one is hungry for, and what kind of pasts and stories and affects are associated with a particular kind of hunger. So the sort of the diversity and complexity of these sort of ecologies vastly transcends what I think certainly English can encompass with the words that we have. So then the question for me was, what kind of layers of translation get caught up in the mix of trying to translate 37 different words for hunger? My friends were always curious to know what would be the word for a Eurasian foreign anthropologist's hunger, right? Because that's a new kind of hunger in its own right. But I think there's something really powerful to be said here about rethinking hunger as a communicable disease. It pushes against the idea that hunger isn't necessarily an individual condition of being. It speaks to sort of the bodily affects that accompany the experience and the witnessing of hunger. And perhaps in that sense, it might also invite us to rethink sort of what I described as the banalization of others' hungers, right? That may be sensationalized in some ways in the media, but quickly forgotten. And it's an invitation, I think, to stay with that communicability and think about the ways in which we might communicate hungers to one another in all their differences.
Yeah, really interesting.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
Do you want to go to the online?
I'll do an online question and then I'll come back to you, Evelyn. So Emma Koval has 2 questions. So we'll go first one and then we'll go to the second one. So Emma says, brilliant talk. I wondered whether there are factions within the Marind in terms of attitudes to the modern and engagement with capitalism beyond the gender divides you have discussed. So what are the effects of religion, age, social status, or anything else?
Thank you so much, Emma. And it's wonderful that you can join us online.
I could just come a bit closer, then you'll
Scoot
be
over.
more on the camera. Yeah. The online wants to see you.
Brilliant. Thank you. Oh,
Yeah.
I'm on the camera. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Emma. Yes. Thank you again for giving me the opportunity to flesh out more of the nuances to the story. So certainly the gender divide is one, although I should say, it's also very, very, it's not quite that simple. Women themselves are very sort of torn over, I suppose in particular, whether to frame hunger as a consequence of settler-colonial violence or whether to frame it as a consequence of the complicity of Marind men who are, who have a monopoly over decision making under customary law and in ways that have been amplified under settler-colonial rule. And so there's some really, really interesting sort of nascent indigenous feminisms, I suppose, going on here that are both a critique of settler-colonial violence and also predating sort of institutions and structures of power. Alongside that gender divide, intergenerational factions also very much part of the picture. Many young Marind will have visited or worked or studied in the city. Some of them are very much seeing in the plantation sector the promise of economic growth, social mobility, and so forth. So that's very much part of the story. And I think, Marind often describe themselves, self-identify as pro-Sawit and contra-Sawit, for oil palm and anti-oil palm. And of course, that encompasses a whole range of often constantly shifting sort of positionalities, with most people really on the fence, inhabiting this space that people call abu-abu, or grayness, or uncertainty, right? Where people are still very much looking for the path, as they sort of struggle to sustain pre-existing, systems and ecosystems, whilst also acknowledging that oil palm is here to stay. And how does one reconcile struggles for survivance with the need to, live with or become with this invasive, plant and associated infrastructures. So that sort of pro and contra divide is also part of the story. Religion is an interesting one. Marind were sort of, there's two things I want to say. First of all, is that a lot of my research, I have to say, was sponsored by the Catholic Church, and they made so much of this work possible. And so in my work, I don't delve into too much of the sort of politics of church, church relations and engagements out of a sense of deep indebtedness to the people who did make this difficult fieldwork possible. But Marind are torn. Many have sort of taken in that sort of etiology of martyrdom that I touched on in the talk, right? This idea that suffering in the present will lead to a better future in the afterlife, that there's a sort of acceptance or embracing of this sort of positioning as a victim within this sort of religious framework, but by no means are all Marind in that particular camp. Many are very opposed to the idea that victimhood is something to be accepted. Many see the Catholic religion itself as a colonial import. For those Marind, the embracing of victimhood is actually profoundly diminishing, because it undermines forms of resistance and struggle and opposition that they see as absolutely vital to their survivance, as Papuans, as Indigenous peoples. So there's a lot of complexity going on in the space of the religion, which again I have always wanted to delve into in more depth, but that I have felt a sense of obligation not to, in light of the people who make so much of this work possible. Thanks, Emma.
Can I just quickly jump on? Because just that idea of the become good food for others, particularly with Catholicism, that seems to fit in really, like, as opposed to say Protestantism, where the sort of body of Christ literally becomes the body of Christ to nourish you. And I wonder, say during the Irish famine and other sort of contexts of hunger and starvation, whether particularly in Catholic nations, whether there are similar ideas of being nourished through the body of Christ and things like that.
Absolutely. The priests in their sermons frequently invoke that parallel between being eaten, or eating and being eaten in the forest, and then sort of religious context. It's the priests in Papua are not Papuan. They're mostly Javanese or from other parts of the archipelago. So that particular interpretation is not one that Marind themselves would offer up, but it's certainly one that is very much part of the kind of gastro-religiosities, if you wish, of what's happening in the area.
Before we go to Evelyn, we'll just do the second part of Emma's question, which was, what do you think people mean by modern? Have the desires for and critiques of the modern changed over the time you've worked with Marind?
Yeah, thanks, Emma. So people use the word modern, which is an Indonesian translation of modern. And it's the modern world means a whole array of different things. It's a sort of framing that is interscalar, I suppose, in Gabrielle Hecht's sense of the term, in the sense that it refers at times to the Indonesian nation state. It refers at others to the global north. It refers in some instances to the global food production, global food chain across its transnational manifestations, industrial food production change. Modern is also colored. Modernity is white, but modernity is also brown. But in the context of Indonesia being framed as modern, the modern world is this this world of plastic, right? And that idiom of plastic speaks to both a sense of modernity as something that proliferates uncontrollably, and that is often deceptive, right? So all manner of things and beings and practices that purport to, or that come tethered with a promise of betterment, but that end up disappointing, are often characterized as modern. Instant noodles is a great example. They arrive in shiny plastic wrappings. They taste good at the time, but half an hour later you're hungry again and you're clamoring for more, right? If anything, instant noodles, the plasticness of instant noodles, not only doesn't satiate your hunger, it makes you more hungry, right? It creates more hunger. People will talk about government officials as being plastic or modern in the sense that they arrive dressed in their fancy suits and polished shoes and make all kinds of promises of employment and compensation that never materialize. So again, plastic beings. So I think that idiom of plastic, I suppose, is the one that really ties together all the different subjects and scales and settings, and that for Marind coalesce in this idea of modernity and the modern world.
Perfect, thank you. Evelyn, we'll have you your question.
It's a great talk, Sophie. Thank you very much. I'm intrigued about your use of the etymology of hunger. I really liked how you framed getting to the base of what hunger means, particularly when there's 37 different iterations of it. You touched on the gender issue a bit, but I'm interested in your take on the patriarchal structures that are culturally embedded and how that creates an incongruence with how people experience hunger there by gender. And you even said that I think education is limited there as well to a specific gender. So I'm just wondering a bit about how women can advocate for the hunger that is both for children and for women.
Thank you so much, Evelyn. Yeah, I'm still working my way through how to do justice to both sides of this sort of critique of hunger that is being articulated by a Papuan woman, in light of the fact that this is a two-pronged critique, right? Both of the consuming violence of settler-colonial orders and also of the lack of voice and representation that women have in the context of local, everyday, land-related decisions on management, use, and sales, and so forth. So my thinking in this space is very much inspired by Indigenous Pacific scholars like Nani Trask, Kahole Hall, who are problematizing what a Pacific feminism looks like, right? And if we should even be using, the term feminist in this, particular social cultural context. Marind women, as you pointed out, noted, they are rural. Most of them are illiterate. They, wouldn't self-identify as feminists per se, but a lot of their struggles are very much framed in gender terms, right? So there is profound discontent, frustration, rage. I use Audre Lorde a lot in this work to think about the uses of rage because it's so much part of the sort of cathartic function that in some ways talking about hunger offered to women, even in the absence of organized collective women's movements on the ground, right? There are no grassroots organizations yet. There are no collectives yet in the sort of more formal sense. These are everyday conversations, everyday discourses. That's where the sort of epistemic resistance is happening for now. But one of the most interesting dimensions of this gendered sort of dynamic was that a lot of the women that I spoke to were uncertain whether, if they were in the position of men, if they did have the power to make the decisions over land, would they act otherwise? Would they decide otherwise? Right. So, is the issue here the fact of the men being in control of the decisions, or is it the fact that they've made those decisions? Because that brings up all kinds of interesting questions for women as to whether they would choose otherwise in their position. So there's an incredible sort of detachment and consequent critical analysis of positionalities both existing and imagined among these women. And again, we're back in that space of the abu-abu, the uncertainty, the grayness that so many of my friends used to describe life and possibilities at the intersections of custom and colonialism.
Thanks so much. Any other questions for those of us in the room?
Yeah, I mean, I'm so grateful for this wonderful talk, and so moved. I'm also very interested in really this idea of hunger and what a wonderful opportunity this is to think about like 37 and more different ways of hunger in the world, right? And how they operate discursively and definitely are translated in public health settings and food studies. So my question is about the disciplinary implications, or I mean, I'm thinking of once went to a sort of food studies conference and asked the big food studies Stephen Devereux person about, like, I asked him, what is hunger? How do we think about hunger? Because hunger is this very powerful metric, right? It's measured in all these different ways, like policymakers, and you sort of say, oh, well, it's a feeling. And I'm also thinking of Kirsten Hastrup. I don't know if you know this wonderful, of course, The Hunger and the Hardness of Facts. And it's so wonderful to sit here today thinking about that paper and how she really makes a strong case to think effectively about hunger and to use hunger as this way that helps us move, right, across disciplines and across this divide, which is one of modernity in terms of separating hard facts from experience and affect. So I guess I just wanted to sort of hear your thoughts and thinking, because I think some of the discussion that happens when social scientists try to speak to that different group of people is that it just comes down to, well, hunger is a feeling, it's like, how do we measure? And it becomes something that's sort of really hard to quantify. And I think in our reading group, we also had some discussions about how this very powerful and beautiful and important, right? As social scientists, we know that the wetness and the forest and this eco-cosmology and way of living and thinking and all these things are important. But how do we translate that, not just in a way that's good for people who are hungry, but that also is a good way of thinking and promoting a good thinking? Sorry for that enormous.
Yeah, no, just that. How do we translate? Yeah, it's such a big question. I mean, I was thinking, I spent a lot of time trying to unpack how I would understand and work through the relationship between hunger as an emic, idiom, and then food security and food sovereignty and malnutrition, which are all sort of tied into the picture, but each, of course, then inflected by particular, their own situatedness and efficacy in the context of different sort of audiences, right? Marind, they use the term malnutrition and food security when they're involved in court cases and, submissions to UN human rights bodies and so forth, because they know those words are intelligible and actionable by these global audiences. So they're very aware of who they're in conversation with. In everyday life, it's never those terms. It's always about hungers, different kinds of hungers. So, I mean, I think what has helped me in terms of trying to present this material to folks, for instance, at the Charles Perkins Centre where I work in Sydney, who are some, hard scientists, has been to, well, first of all, actually get them to experiment with their own bodies and hunger. So, what does it actually feel like to go really hungry, to allow yourself to experience that on a sort of physiological, emotional, psychological level, right? What kind of wants and lacks are conjured in that experience that is neither body or mind, but so distinctly kind of a bit of both. And then it's trying to explore hunger as something that's not just about an absence of food in generic terms, right? That the kind of food that nourishes matters, and that for all the science that can help us understand what is nutritional or not, at the end of the day, the ecologies of meaning are profoundly going to shape what people choose to eat or choose not to eat, right? So palatability, substitutability are all so interwoven with the cultural construction of what food is and means and what it does and what we do with it, right? So it's not an easy translational labor. It's really, really difficult. How do these ecologies or theories of hunger then, do they become actionable? How do I translate 37 hungers, in the context of a policy process, for instance? It's not easy. I think I'm still very much working on it, as are Marind, for that matter. But I think what came out of the research also was that hunger is often seen as a bad thing, right? It's a lack, and it is in many ways. It's a diminishing experience. But not all hungers are bad. If anything, Marina teaching is that perhaps a world of no hunger is not so much what we should be aiming for, than rather a careful apprenticeship in what hunger might teach us about ourselves and about others, right? 25 of the 37 terms for hunger are about good hungers. To become hungry because you've worked in the grove and fished for a day to feed your kin and you're starving, that's a good kind of hunger because you've invested your body in caring for others, right? other hungers are not so good, right? There's a morality going on here, which I think invites us to move beyond a black and white understanding of what hunger is, and instead try to think about it as a relation, ultimately, a political and a politicized relation that tells us something about the consumer as the consumed, and everything that becomes a byproduct in that process. So that was a very social science answer to it.
Can I make a quick quip in response, which is just to say that this is such a powerful provocation, and we've sort of been joking about how wonderful it is that we very deliberately asked for a big budget for food during this workshop, because we thought it would be really important to have nourishing and delicious food while we write. But maybe we should also have thought about having no food at all.
No,
I've been to enough of those.
Just no diet theory. Sorry.
I think by the reaction in the room, the big budget.
Wouldn't have had any takers.
So we have just under 10 minutes, so we've got probably time for one or two more questions. Anyone in the room want to take the floor? Kelly?
I've got a thank you for that amazing presentation. I've got a quick question about how protein, you mentioned protein, and how kind of protein circulates through the Marind community in particular, and its relationship to plastic food, because obviously it's a very kind of nutritional discourse. So how is it kind of like infiltrated, and how does that, I guess, relate to their ideas about nourishment and what it means to eat well?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So proteins, they're traditionally derived from hunting activities in the forest, game, cassowaries, boars, tree kangaroos, and so forth. Hunting is a male-only activity, with foraging and hunting distributed across men and women. Marind don't necessarily use the word protein per se, but the word for meat, which is in some ways, how they would understand, or an approximation of how we would understand protein, is described as a kind of food that is very, very rich in skin and wetness, and the meats are circulated across the village. So men will go out and hunt in parties, and then they will bring the catch back to the village, and it will be divided equally amongst all members of the community, with particular cuts reserved depending on age, gender, and so forth. Chronic protein malnutrition, protein energy malnutrition, is one of the major has been one of the major consequences of the transition from forest foodways to sort of commodified foodways. People really rarely have the chance to eat meat at all now. Forest is going, so hunting is becoming increasingly difficult. So it's a very, very carbohydrate heavy sort of diet: instant noodles and rice and biscuits. The occasional vegetable from a little plot in the village, although Marind don't, they're not horticulturalists by tradition, but that has been one of the biggest transformations, and that protein is no longer circulating the way it was, and that the sociality of hunting as well is disappearing in ways that are reshaping the sort of food provision roles of men in all kinds of interesting ways.
And is the oil palm plantation kind of accompanied by its own form of protein? Like, is it bringing another like tinned fish or
Not in Papua, no. Unlike in Papua New Guinea, where canned meats and spam and mutton flaps have been a big part of the sort of gastrocolonial systems. That is not so much the case in West Papua. It really is starches, inordinate amounts of starch. That even that are often offered up by companies as part of their corporate social responsibility packages, or often actually in exchange for land surrendered. But the protein is very much lacking and in dire absence.
Thank you. So we'll have, I think, one last question. So who wants to? Tyler?
All right. Obviously, great talk, Sophie. I'm thinking about the perhaps something about like the removal of these kind of like more than human relationships with the creation of these palms. Obviously, there's this kind of shift in these kind of like the meats that people consume, they're no longer around. Is there any kind of impact on their kind of like cosmologies in terms of relational kind of aspects to kind of the more than human in these spaces. You know, the forests are getting cleared, the palms are coming in, but there's also, I guess, somewhat of a resistance. Like there's the sago, which are growing in there as well. So are they kind of seeing it as kind of like a bit of a shift in those kind of ways in terms of their approaches with the kind of the more than human?
Thanks, Tyler. Yes, I mean, so much of the way in which Marind would describe their condition of life was through indexical or antagonistic relations or analogous relations with other than human beings, both native and introduced. So, on one level, Marind and their forest kin are part of what Tom Van Doren calls a community of faith, right? In the face of the expansion of these monocrops, in the sense that they are all going hungry and being, stripped of the environments that enable them to survive and thrive. But there are all kinds of other sort of interspecies dynamics emerging in the context of this shift. One of the most interesting ones relates to introduced parasites and mutualistic species in oil palm ecology. So your beetles, your bugs, your fungi, your rats, your porcupines, species that are finding new futures and fodder in the company of oil palm in these seemingly impoverished monocrops, and that then point to the fact that there is life going on there, not just the oil palm, but other creatures, modest communities of critters, not your charismatic megafauna. And why do those interspecies relations matter? Well, I mean, parasites for many Marind activists have become figures of hope and resistance, right? They are sabotaging the capitalist project by literally eating away at this plant that is a source of profit and a form of capital. So here the parasites are, heralders of a kind of multi-species justice, if you would, right? The forest biting back, if you wish. Mutualists, on the other hand, offer a kind of solace to those Marind who are now very much invested in the plantation sector and working as laborers, who have already ceded their lands. Why? And because mutualists are not, fighting against oil palm, they've learned to live with it in relations where each party benefits. So there seem to be points to a kind of accommodation or compromise or negotiation in this sort of forging of a new kind of cohabitability with oil palm. So both of those sort of communities of life, if you wish, are offering different kinds of, paths forward, if you wish, for Marind who are for or against oil palm. And all of that gets even more interesting when you think about mutualistic species that were actually introduced to Papua as beneficial species that help sustain oil palm's growth, and that at some point turn the tables and suddenly become invasive, where they spread in overabundant numbers. So a kind of resistance from within, right? A seeming ally turns into a foe. So again, all kinds of really fascinating analogies and indexicalities that play in the story that make it therefore a more than human story, both in the context of traditional ecologies and in the context of emergent ecologies on the plantation landscape.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Tyler.
Thanks so much, Sophie. So we'll end there. We're at time. Once again, thank you for the wonderful talk. I think that's started our day off pretty well, and I think it's given us a lot to think about for the rest of the day and for tomorrow here at the workshop. Karina, any last words you want to say?
It's been such a wonderful pleasure. Thank you so much
for having me, and thank you to everyone for the questions, for giving me food